Good afternoon. My name is Sam Westrop. I am the director of Islamist Watch, one of the counter-extremism programs of the Middle East Forum. For the last few years, we have investigated the flow of government monies into the hands, into the pockets of extremist groups across America, across Europe, across elsewhere. This started with a look at federal funding and tens of millions of dollars of federal monies working their way into the pockets of these Islamist organizations, these Islamist movements. But over the last year, we've started to expand our investigations to state and city funding as well. Across the country, you, the taxpayer, are subsidizing extremism. And with this latest outbreak of terror and barbarism in the Middle East, I'm afraid your taxpayers' dollars are subsidizing the financiers of these extremists, of these terrorists, of these murderers in the Middle East. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Susannah Johnston, my colleague, who is the investigative reporter at Focus on Western Islamism, our counter-Islamist media outlet. And Susannah has been taking the lead on this investigation, on this research into state and city funding. And I think this will be a worthwhile discussion no matter what was going on in the news. I think now it is particularly important to talk about some of the things we're finding, some of the things Susannah is finding. So Susannah, to start off with, I know we were originally going to discuss this problem more broadly, but I think for the moment, tell us about your findings, your research as they relate to Hamas, to the Muslim Brotherhood, and to those organizations in the West that support this extremism, this terror.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. And I'm glad that we can have this conversation. One thing I wanted to just touch on here is just very briefly the Muslim Brotherhood and then Hamas, and then how these groups in the U.S. are tied to Hamas, as I think it's particularly relevant right now. I mean, I think always relevant, but of course with the news right now, it might be helpful. I'm hoping that this will be informative enough and concise enough that you might want to share with friends and family who are less, perhaps less well versed in this than our audience. But, just noting that a number of these U.S. organizations, as Sam has said, we started going state by state, and a number of the organizations that have received funding at the state level and sometimes at the city level, as we're finding, have their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly. The Muslim Brotherhood, as you probably are very well, was founded in 1928 in Egypt. And then it's had a number of offshoots from that. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I was looking at Hamas's charter last night, and I want to throw this out there because I think that it can be helpful in our discussions, when people are getting all confused in the news and what they're seeing about, oh, well, who is Hamas really? But this is from their charter. So on the destruction of Israel, here is a quote from the preamble of Hamas's charter. This is, of course, an English translation. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And then this is their rejection of a negotiated peace settlement, also from the Hamas charter. Peace initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions in international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. Those conferences are no more than a means to appoint the infidels as arbitrators in the lands of Islam. There is no solution for the Palestinian problem except by jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are but a waste of time and exercise in futility. So, now let's, look over at the U.S. You have a number of organizations that the Middle East Forum writes about frequently. And we often say, hey, they're tied to Hamas. And what does that mean that they're tied to Hamas? So first, in terms of state funding, we have not done all the United States. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten that far yet. But we've looked at New York, we've looked at California, or we're starting to look at California. We have taken a peek at New Jersey, Massachusetts. So in California, California is forking over at least thousands to CARE. They have, they're doing it. Los Angeles and San Diego have handed over large amounts of money.
Sorry to interrupt, Susannah,
yes.
But just very briefly explain who CARE is and why they're relevant.
Yes. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. The Council on American Islamic Relations. They were founded in 1994. Their founder, Nihad Awad, an FBI affidavit said that he was an active member of the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1994, Nihad Awad publicly stated his support for Hamas. And if you go and look at his Twitter now, you can see his lovely support of, or not so lovely support, obviously, of what's going on in Israel right now. It's pretty disturbing, but he is still the executive director of CARE. His co-founder was identified as a Hamas leader in the Holy Land Foundation case, which is one of the largest U.S. terror finance cases. The Holy Land Foundation was prosecuted by the U.S. government for fueling millions to Hamas, and CARE was an unindicted co-conspirator. So I apologize that I did the opposite of what I intended to do there. But California is giving them is giving CARE a lot of money currently. So then I thought I would just mention a few other organizations within different states who are also receiving funding, and that they are also tied to Hamas. So in New York, you have we found that the Muslim American Society has been given $2.5 million. That's the Muslim American Society of Upper New York. The national organization was founded as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the U.S. Sam, I don't know if you want to add further commentary to that, but their leadership has openly championed Hamas. Both the Muslim American Society and the Council on American Islamic Relations are part of the USCMO, which just issued their own statement that Dexter Van Zyl just wrote about. I think it was published either yesterday or today at Focus on Western Islamism, about their support of Hamas and the grievous atrocities going on. And then in New Jersey, we have not taken a deep dive at New Jersey, but I did want to mention that I did briefly see that the North American Islamic Trust has received funding from New Jersey. That's another unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation case. They wrote checks to a Hamas leader. You also have ICNA Relief has received money from the state of New Jersey. They are buddies with Al-Khidmat, and I did check yesterday, Sam, since we talked about this, they openly defend their relationship with Al-Khidmat, which is the South Asian group, charitable arm of Jamaat-e Islami, and Sam has written a lot about that. Sam, I don't know if you want to add more comments there, but Al-Khidmat has given money to Hamas. So, ICNA Relief received money from New Jersey, and then ICNA Relief partners with at best partners with unsavory characters.
So Susannah, then to clarify, so we've got two issues here. We have organizations in the US that are ideologically supportive of Hamas, or the Muslim Brotherhood, that are receiving money directly. We also have Islamist organizations, I think from what you're saying, that take money from state government that then support other Islamist organizations around the world, which then in turn move money to Hamas. So we've both got direct ideological support and indirect financial support. Is that about right?
Yes, definitely. And I think that makes it difficult when we're talking about, well, what do you do about this? And then at the same time, makes it really clear that it's a problem.
Interesting.
I think it gives them a little cover.
Right. Now, to the audience, if you have, I've got a few more things to ask Susannah. Susannah's got a lot to tell us about. But if you have questions for Susannah, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask these questions, and I will get to them shortly. Susannah.
Just one more organization I wanted to add in that, and that's Illinois has earmarked each year $150,000 to the Bridgeview Mosque. The Bridgeview Mosque in Illinois, outside of Chicago, they were taken over by Muslim Brotherhood people in the 1980s, and they shouldn't be receiving any money, which hopefully they're not. Hopefully it was just an earmark, but they've gotten the earmark for several years in a row. So problematic.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned a few states here. So the amounts we're talking about is just presumably a very small proportion of the total amounts of money given across the country by state and city governments to these pro-Hamas, to these pro-Muslim Brotherhood organizations. It's difficult to extrapolate, of course, and guess a total number nationally. But in terms of the amounts for the states you have studied, I think you mentioned a few, New York, Massachusetts, Michigan, Illinois, and so on. What kind of amounts are we talking about here? Are we just talking a few thousand? Are we talking more than that? What are the sums of money involved here?
In terms of Muslim Brotherhood affiliates, we're talking about millions. State of New York alone, which is not just Muslim Brotherhood groups, it's other Islamist groups as well. State of New York, it's close to 24 million. So if you look at, I mean, that's the state that we've done the deepest dive on, like how much money has actually been forked out. And so yesterday, when I was looking at California and all of their files, everything that I was looking at was just for 1 year. And almost every single month of 2022, you saw CARE's name mentioned as a recipient more than once. So not every month, but that's just 1 year. So it's a lot of money.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned California is perhaps next on the list of states to investigate. I mean, are we starting at the worst first? Do you assume by the time you get to the Midwestern states that are a little perhaps less politically involved with Islamism or less politically sympathetic to radical causes, do you expect that state funding will exist there as well? Or do you think this is a problem across America and that state governments, regardless of their politics, are funding the wrong people?
I think some of both. I've taken a glance at Virginia. You saw less in Virginia, but then we also need to check out our cities as well, which we've touched on that just briefly. I mean, you've got Chicago, you've got New York City, you've got Los Angeles, San Diego. What's happening in Atlanta? So I think we're going to see some of both. But I think that population is going to be also a significant factor as well. I mean, California has a huge population. New York has a huge population. So there's going to be more money floating around to some of these groups. And to a certain extent, yeah, absolutely, the politics is going to play a role in that.
Why are these grants being given out? Do we know the purpose of these grants, what they're for, why they're being earmarked for these Islamist groups, or is that just not clear?
So in New York, it's almost all education grants. I mean, almost all of it. I think it was like slightly over 23 million is the total, and then 23 million is education. In some instances, it's in California, you've got a lot of immigration grants because CARE is involved with the immigration angle. You also have some security grants, like security grants for mosques. So it's a mix, but there was a lot of education funding in there.
Interesting. And what do we think? Do we have any idea of the proportion that's going to Islamist groups as opposed to ordinary Muslim groups? And by that, I'm not asking for a definite figure, as it's certainly difficult to delineate. But I suppose my question would be, do we think a majority of the money here is subsidizing extremism, or is this just a small amount of the total grants to the Muslim community that are being given out?
You mean that Islamists receiving more money than non-Islamists who are, more reformist Muslims? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's my question. Is the government funding the Muslim community equally, both bad and good, or are Islamists ultimately benefiting more than ordinary Muslims from this taxpayer subsidy?
Well, I think this is a risky statement. I think it's a little slanted towards the Islamist, but that is not a statement I can back up at the moment.
Okay, so we need more data, more research. Perhaps we can answer that question in a few months' time. And the idea here is, Susannah, I believe that eventually what we hope to do is publish our findings in this database, a comprehensive map of the United States, where you can, in your area, see if your city, if your state is funding Islamism, is subsidizing Islamism, allowing you, the taxpayer, to now go, hopefully, and do something about that. Susannah, we've talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, we've talked about Hamas. What about other Islamist groups, other Islamist movements? Are you seeing other types of Islamism pop up in your research?
Sure. Yeah, one thing I wanted to touch on was what's happening in New York, just because I've looked a lot at the numbers there and spent a lot of time looking into different groups that have received money. A lot of schools have received money. And these are organizations that we have not really seen before. And they are teaching their kids, certainly based off of either speakers that they have come in and had speak at their mosques or schools, pretty radical individuals. So, for example, Al Madrasa Al Islamia in New York, they've received 1.6 million. There's a book in their curriculum that calls Judaism, quote, a tribal religion. In that same book, they had some pretty horrific stuff about kidnapping women and children. And this stuff is presented as good in the book, and this book is part of the school's curriculum. And other places like this, Al Ihsan Academy, this is another school in New York. They've received 5.6 million. They hosted Sheikh Shafayat Muhammad. He has called Jews and Christians perverted transgressors. He has referred to Jews as apes and swine. So these are not, friendly people. And these are schools that, as far as I know, there's not much has been written about them, which is, concerning. You asked a few minutes ago, why are they receiving money? I think that's a really good question. Did they apply for these grants? Is someone looking into, organizations like who's vetting and why? It's something that we definitely need to be talking to our representatives about, and also paying attention in our own states. Where are our taxpayers going? Taxpayer dollars going?
Okay. Now we've had a ton of questions, and I think let's turn to that a little earlier than I hoped. And if we've got time, I'll return to some of my other questions directly for you, Susannah. Have you asked state and city officials about this money? Has anyone raised this? Are people outraged? Are politicians doing anything about it? We've had a number of questions saying, did Illinois government ever respond to your article about the Nation of Islam institutions taking money from the taxpayer? Similarly, someone asks, again, an anonymous attendee says, what is it like trying to get public officials to explain why these groups get the money? Do they even return your call? So tell us about the response from government officials or from interested parties.
No, Illinois never responded. I reached out to the governor's office multiple times, no comment. I reached out to a number of elected officials in Illinois, and the response was quite lackluster. I think that now might be a really good time to follow up with them, especially, it's pretty awful, to have basically just this horrible global scene right now, but maybe they would wake up at this point and go, oh, who is it that we're funding? So I think that we can reach back out and see if if we can have some conversations about cutting off the funding. For New York, the governor's office did not respond. Again, might be worth reaching out to them again in light of global events. But we did have a city council member that, if you saw that article in the New York Funding, Anna Vernikov, she was furious about it and really concerned. Then you also have Dov Hikind, former rep in the state. He was very upset about it, and he said that he wanted to go to the governor and make sure that the funding is cut off, and he was very serious about it. So I know that if you're living in New York, there are definitely people who are interested in making sure this funding is cut off, and that was very hopeful. California, we haven't gotten that far. New Jersey, we have not gotten that far. Massachusetts, Dexter has had some conversations, but I think his conversations didn't go anywhere with government officials. Sam, I don't know if you can speak to that or not.
Yeah, well, in fact, we had a couple of questions about these Islamist groups and whether they respond to the accusations of their extremism when the taxpayer funding is pointed out. And indeed, our colleague Dexter Van Zyl, who's managing editor of Focus on Western Islamism, just published an article yesterday on the Islamist response to the violence in Israel, and I believe received not a single word back from any of the extremist pro-Muslim Brotherhood groups that he reached out to. So yes, there's a constant attempt to speak to not just public officials, but also the extremists in question, and see if we can get them to address these allegations, address the fact they're using public monies to subsidize extremist rhetoric and behaviors, but they perhaps rather wisely stay pretty quiet when questioned. Susannah, Roz and Michael Shorenstein ask, They want to know about the schools. They say, why are these presumably private religious schools receiving public funds? Do Catholic or Jewish schools also receive such funding? Do you happen to know the answer to that one?
They do. They do get funds. So the Catholic schools and the Jewish schools are receiving funds. Um, so I mean,
Okay.
I think that yeah. Anyway,
Yeah. In fact, I can
and
add to that.
same thing in Illinois. I mean, you see just like enormous amounts of money being forked out, and I think that probably in some sense gives these Islamist cover in getting money because you'd be like, oh well, these other people got money too. Why shouldn't we get money?
Yeah.
But if you're intent on you know extra teaching your children extremist ideologies, and that's a problem.
Right. And in fact, I can add a little bit to that just because at the federal level, we also see a huge amount of funding going to schools of all persuasions. And indeed, we've noticed Islamist groups being very supportive of the conservative effort to privatize schooling in the United States, precisely because it allows them to push their ideology to Muslim kids across the country through private schools, but also subsidized by the taxpayer. And that subsidies come in the form of not just school vouchers and various tax-related breaks, but also things like school lunches and various programs operated even by departments like Department for Agriculture provides a huge amount to Islamist schools across the country. So there's a lot of different programs benefiting all types of schools, and Islamists benefit enormously from it. So it's interesting, Susannah, that you're seeing the same within the state data as I was seeing for federal data. Now, Mark Wijda, I'm very apologetic if I mispronounce your name, asked any problematic funding in Texas. And actually, I can also add here, Susannah, that we did start looking at Texas rather recently. And yes, there is some cause for concern. Mark, we will get back to you once we've published and finished combing through that data, as there's a lot to look at. In Texas, the problem is less state funding, it seems to us, but more city funding. Certain larger cities, local city councils working with the wrong people. But we will be publishing on that sometime soon. Susannah, an anonymous.
Wait, along those lines, Sam, have we looked at Houston? Have you seen
Houston,
any of the numbers out of Houston?
yeah, Houston is also on the list. There's some worrying stuff in there. Again, I think we should probably finish going through it before we comment, but Mark, we will publish an article on this pretty shortly that should answer these questions. And Susannah, an anonymous attendee asked, what do you think if the Westboro Baptist Church ever received public funds? That is, would public officials tolerate it in the way that funding for Islamists seems to be tolerated?
Well, I certainly hope not. um, yeah, I see this question here. No, sorry, go ahead.
Well, is there a fundamental fear here of standing up to Islamists receiving public funds? There's a certain, I think across the spectrum, people are willing to hold the Westboro Baptist Church to account because of the overt awfulness and iniquity of their behaviors. Really, we would expect the same when it comes to pro-Hamas groups in the United States, and yet for some reason they've been receiving both federal and state funds for years. Is this just a double standard? Is there a fear on the part of just to speculate? What would you imagine?
I think it's mostly ignorance. I think that the Islamist groups have done a phenomenal job of calling their critics Islamophobic. And I think that we need to be really good at pointing back to things like the Hamas Charter and saying, look, these are their founding documents. And here are their statements over the years, here are their actions over the years of funding. I mean, in the case of Hamas, the murder, murder, slaughter of people, destruction of Israel, destruction of the West. That's not Islamophobia. But I think that the Islamist groups here in the U.S. have been really good after 9/11, flipping. I mean, they're even trying to dismantle the terror watch list, counterterrorism efforts in the U.S. They've been really successful, horrifyingly successful in Canada. And then, Sam, I don't know if you want to talk about the UK and what's going on there, but I think that we have opportunity here. They are coming out. A number of these organizations and their leadership are coming out right now in support of Hamas, and we should hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah. Now, Susan Mayer asks, how is money given to mosques justified when churches get no money from government agencies? Likewise, we've had a couple of questions about asking about banning the transfer of public funds to all religious institutions and so on. Susanna, I don't know what you found in the state level. I can certainly say from the federal funding, firstly, that churches get a huge amount of money from the federal government, just millions and millions and millions in the form of all sorts of programs. So there is an enormous amount of funding of religious institutions in this country, despite the many Supreme Court cases and precedents and religious rulings on separation of church and state, indeed mosque and state as well. So religious funding exists. The problem, it seems to me, Susanna, is that when the government funds Muslim communities, they're not taking a second to determine whether they're messing with the politics of that Muslim community. That is, by funding, when New York City government or state government turns to the Muslim community and funds groups like CARE New York, like Muslim American Society, like these schools linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, what they're doing is they're helping these Islamists impose control over New York Muslims, over New York Muslim communities. In other words, taxpayer funds serve to impose Islamist control over Muslim communities and wipe out ordinary moderate Muslim resistance. Is this your take as well? Do you think that government funding doesn't just benefit them financially, but also ideologically?
So I think the thing here is that these schools, churches, mosques, religious private schools, they're receiving these funds for things like an education grant, like SNAP benefits, which, like food benefits, make sure all the children are fed. That's a great thing. But the problem is that money is fungible. And I think that we've seen this happen, terrible example, but Afghanistan, we send in, aid to help people. And then what does the, leadership do? They turn around and it's like, oh, okay, well, don't have to pay those people. And then they have more money to carry out their nefarious activities. I think that that's happening on a much smaller scale here in the US, but it's happening nonetheless with some of these really concerning groups that are receiving money.
Interesting. I wish we had time to go over the rest of these questions. There's a ton more questions about Canada, other states. I think just to respond that, Susanna, you're looking into other states. There'll be more published in the next few months. That's right. And eventually, I think we also hope to get to other countries as well. I will just give one last question from, again, someone who doesn't give their name, but asks, how can we look into this ourselves? State budgets and expenditures should be publicly accessible. Susanna, are they? Is it easy to find this information?
So a lot of it is publicly accessible. It can be really difficult to weed through. That's some of what's hampered us in getting this information out there faster is that, for example, if you go look at California, if you want me to email you the link, just send me an email. It's johnston@meforum.org, and I'd be happy to send you the link like for California or as we're going along if you're interested in a particular state. But for example, California, you go to their webpage, and for 2022, it's 12 different Excel files. And then you've got to go through all that information. So it's publicly available. It's just tricky weeding through it. New York is a lot easier. They have a fantastic website. Good job, whoever designed it. But you can go in there and individually select. It's the comptroller's website for the state of New York. So and every state does their funding differently. There's different degrees of transparency, different degrees of organization. Some people are just way better organized. Some websites are way more up to date. So a lot of it is publicly available, or I should say, publicly accessible. I think technically it should be available to you in your state. How responsive your government officials will be to getting you that information, try, ask, and then if they don't give it to you, make sure you're friends with your state rep and talk to them and say why it's a problem and get them to get the information for you.
Okay. Susanna, thank you so much for your time. There's obviously a lot more research we're waiting to see you comb through and publish, and I look forward to reading more of your articles as they come out on this subject. To the audience, if you want to read Susanna's existing articles on government funding of Islamism, you can do so at Focus on Western Islamism. The URL for that is islamism.news. Susanna, thank you so much for joining us. To the audience, I'm sorry I didn't get through the rest of your questions. There were many more, We will touch on this subject many times in the future, I'm sure. Thank you very much for joining us. Please subscribe to the Middle East Forum's webinar mailing list if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.